President Trump and his allies have spent years campaigning against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI, in companies and organizations. Now, these attacks come on three main levels. First, opposing the actual programs that recruit for diversity, like affirmative action or projects to counter unequal playing fields in business, government, college, or life. And there's a valid debate over whether and how to address America's documented discrimination. It actually draws on decades of debates about rules, laws, and policies. The second line of attack is DEI complaints that operate as a kind of symbolic or darker attack on American diversity itself, on the people that make our country diverse. In that line of attack, which I bet you've heard about and seen, grievances against minorities or women or their possibly rising power in our society are used to single out, criticize, or malign those people and then say it's just a policy debate. Now, on the right, most prominent leaders do not proclaim that, quote, there should be no women bosses or no women presidents. Instead, you hear these DEI attacks that traffic sometimes in grievances against the perceived rise of women and minorities. One Trump appointee even proclaimed, quote, competent white men must be in charge. A racist claim that was actually so extreme, most Trump aides, to be clear, don't put it like that. And then third, there are attacks that offer a caricature or a lie about DEI. They basically make something up instead of facing the facts and the nuance. Now, it's familiar from the playbook you might remember against so-called woke politics. There are examples of things that are associated with liberalism that could be unpopular or extreme or not work well as policy. But a lot of the woke attacks from the right kind of cherry-picked extreme examples or made things up of out of whole cloth just to define the supposedly woke left, trolling a kind of a boogeyman version of the thing instead of reckoning with the thing. Now, these efforts, combined with the recent election of Donald Trump, are having a wide impact now, from the government to top companies. And even people who might try to tune out politics are finding this supposed DEI crackdown is driving issues and debates and sometimes big changes in their workplace or in their schools or even in sports. So our special report for you right now is going to confront this DEI debate. And all I can promise you is if you're saying, hey, they're talking about DEI on the news, I don't know, give me a couple minutes, because we've worked hard on this, and it could be enlightening and different from what we've heard about the brand DEI. We want to distinguish the facts and the actual policy from the disingenuous political hype. So let's turn to the caricature I mentioned of diversity programs. As a matter of policy, the United States' broadest diversity program is affirmative action, which is designed to recruit diverse candidates from a qualified pool. It has worked for decades, from the military to top colleges and boardrooms. For example, there may be hundreds of qualified candidates for a single CEO job. So these diversity programs try to make sure the pool of candidates includes some diversity and then factor that into the recruitment and possibly the hiring when people are qualified. If you're curious, it dates all the way back to an executive order by President Kennedy in 1961, which stated the government must take affirmative action to combat racial discrimination and ensure fair treatment in commerce. That's where the two words actually first originated. And it's well documented how colleges have had a long history of discriminating on race, gender, and religion. Negatively, that meant quotas, limiting religious minorities. Or in boosts for elite and white applicants, colleges gave special bonuses for alumni children, reinforcing the elite white student bodies of generations past. Today, it is a fact, as we know, that how that worked. So people who claim that rich and white favoritism is over in elite schools are wrong. They're either lying to you or to themselves. Now, over time, many colleges began countering what you just saw there, that kind of unequal playing field, with affirmative action. And like the CEO example, top schools have many, many more qualified applicants than spots. So this incorporates diversity among qualified applicants. While at less selective schools, these policies mattered less. So if most or all kind of reasonable applicants are admitted, say at a big school, then recruitment and affirmative action fades out of the picture. Now, the political attacks on the letters DEI are fairly new. Decades of data on college affirmative action. It diversified elite institutions, it increased social mobility, and when historically less traditional students got in, and this matters, those students who got in through those programs, do you wonder how they did with all this talk about merit? I want to show you tonight. They did very well. Low-income students completing their degree at higher rates than the wealthy students, according to several studies, which actually fits the logic of hard work and hustle. So now compare this lens to recent DEI attacks. That number one, these programs themselves have become the actual discrimination, rather than the actual history I mentioned of quotas at schools or, of course, Jim Crow. And then two, that the existence of these programs themselves in some places must mean that every minority hire is suspect, like the diss we've heard that someone is a, quote, DEI hire.
Diversity, equity, inclusion, it's actually discriminatory.
What'll make you money is if you run your company based off of merit, not off diversity.
But you just want somebody qualified. That's all we ever asked for.
DEI has no role in our society.
That's all we wanted.
We want someone qualified. That's all we want. And I was on Fox in a recent discussion that is similar to many. So let's take this claim in two parts. First, this DEI hire talk is a huge and obviously offensive allegation. And if you have an allegation, you better be able to prove it against one or more people. The allegation is that women and minorities in a given applicant pool must somehow be unqualified for some reason. And then second, these MAGA leaders are demanding what they say is the import. Formal qualifications. That's all we want. You heard it just there. Qualifications for the big jobs. All right. Let's get to it. Right now, a month into President Trump's term, his appointments show that is false. He's got top people in key posts with scant or sometimes literally zero qualifications, including Nepo baby Robert F. Kennedy Jr., lifelong Democrat picked to run the pivotal health agencies with zero government experience, hasn't run a large health organization in the private sector or anything like that. But remember the vow.
But you just want somebody qualified. That's all we ever asked for. That's all we wanted.
Somebody qualified. That's all they want. That is not what they got. Their new president has failed that test spectacularly and in public. Their test, what they say they want. No, it joins a flurry of blatant nepotism across Trump's two terms, hiring his own family members for jobs ranging from advisors, which some could explain away better, to ambassadorships and diplomacy in other countries with other languages and a rich history where you need some expertise, to heading the whole political party. Family, family, family. It's called nepotism. And these are powerful posts, some of them, with decisions that can be life and death. Trump chose by nepotism and favoritism over the qualifications. That whole objection, which, remember, is one of the key planks of this supposed war on DEI, which now is being waged in the federal government and against companies and affecting your life and your workplace, that objection now has canceled itself in public. Trump shredding the supposed concern about merit. And all of those enablers I mentioned and showed who claimed they cared about that, most of them, as far as we can tell from our research in this segment, this special report, most of them have gone silent. We're not hearing them say, hey, I know I said merit or qualifications for 2 years about DEI. I got to mention the 0 years here. Is it some kind of qualification concern? No, they're silent. One point here is gone. The merit argument, the merit objection, we'll come back to the spike, but the merit objection has canceled itself. Another DEI attack is the claim that America is past the time to remedy discrimination right now. I'm sure you've heard this one. People who say, look, we are a long ways from Jackie Robinson. People who say today's playing field is either basically level or even now tilted towards discriminating against, quote, white men. And I want to be clear, because I always talk to you about what's going on out there and the evidence and the discourse. This is common beyond just, say, partisan right-wing or MAGA circles. Joe Rogan's one of the most popular broadcasters, voices, podcasters in our country. He does fascinating interviews, apart from politics, by the way. But he's got tens of millions of listeners. This is part of what's mainstream today. And here's what he told them.
Most companies have all these different requirements, and they're openly allowed to discriminate against especially heterosexual white men.
All right. This is the news, so we'll deal in the facts. If, quote, most companies are doing that in hiring, you'd see it in hiring. Now, there may be some troubling cases out there, individual situations, DEI practices that are not working, failing, or called DEI and aren't fair. But the overall facts are this. Women are half our population. If you go back about 15 years, before you heard anything about these DEI programs, they comprised about 3% of top company CEOs. Now, that's not a level playing field. Certainly doesn't mean they've been hiring mostly or only women over those white male candidates mentioned by Mr. Rogan. Okay, what is it now today after all this DEI that we've heard about for years? 10% of top CEOs are women. That's across the 500 largest companies after the period of the supposed DEI onslaught or overreach. I'm going to leave this up for you tonight. I told you we'd deal in facts, and sometimes that takes a little longer than sound bites. But either you look at this and you think this is the product of a completely level playing field for gender and hiring, which would mean that, quote, most women are not up to the job. And that's why only 10% are in that leadership position. Or you might look at this and conclude, as many policymakers and experts have, as the courts sometimes have when presented with these kind of disparate data results, that it's not a level playing field. There's still room to grow on hiring and access and diversity. Now, that's gender. And even though I am a man and speaking to you as a person who does journalism, takes the fairness seriously, but I happen to be a guy, for some reason in America, sometimes people have an easier time politically discussing this on gender than on race. So that's the example on gender. Keep that in mind. Either you think only 10% fits, only 10% of women are, quote, up to the job, or you think there's a disparity there. Let's turn to diversity. About 40% of the population now are racial minorities. According to the most recent census 5 years back, they comprise about 14% of CEOs in just the top 50 companies. You see that lagging. Those are the big tech and financial firms which drive Wall Street. That's the top 50. Then you have black CEOs of major companies. And the question is, are we looking at a hiring system where white men face discrimination? That's what I showed you the claim earlier, or a level playing field. And the U.S. has more pronounced discrimination against specifically black individuals. That's true in policing, in banking, mortgages. We've got blind tests where you see that all things being equal in finances, being black hurts your ability to get the same mortgage rate. And we see it in hiring. If you go to the top 500 companies in America, 14% of the population roughly are black Americans. Under 2% of the CEOs are black. This is America. And just like the example I gave with men and women, you can look at that and say, that must reflect a level playing field and who's up to the job, or you might see something else, especially if you add what we know about American history. People can debate whether the federal government should counter that or how. That's part of the debate I showed you earlier. But there's no factual debate on the data. And it's a big contrast to the we have improved arguments. Now, in our democracy, we have seen that voting rights, when they were actually truly expanded and protected by the federal government, the numbers changed more than what I showed you in business. 1960, women were just 4% of the House. That number is much higher now at 29%. It's far short of a full 50% parity, but you see the jump. In 1960, racial minorities were 11% of the population, but less than 2% of Congress. Now, again, it's over 40% of the population, and that diversity shift reflects probably some of the tensions and dynamics in play. But those groups comprise nearly a third of Congress. Racial representation is closer to the general population than gender today. And I mentioned that comparison to 1960. That's before the civil and voting rights laws passed. And that's not a coincidence. In the old days, we might just say, duh, because in the old days, some of these things weren't attacked by so many blatant lies, which can be exhausting to deal with. But those laws work to advance representation in Congress in ways that we haven't seen extended in business. Another historical point tonight, over time, both parties actually renewed those voting rights laws. So the voting rights was fortified. It was supported on a bipartisan basis, and it protected the representation that allowed everyone to run and vote. May the best person win the race. In fact, here are some Republicans you might know on that point.
4 decades since the Voting Rights Act was first passed, we made progress toward equality, yet the work for a more perfect union is never ending.
Fair. So let's live this together with the history and the facts. That was the Republican vow across those times. That's across decades. President Reagan also very clearly announced his affirmative action approach in hiring one of the most important posts, putting a woman, the first woman, on the Supreme Court. He was a Republican, considered very conservative at the time, very different from what we're seeing from Republican Donald Trump. Today, Republicans very much say that work is ending, in contrast to what Bush said, never ending. The president not only gutting diversity programs within his administration, but keep in mind he's taking a big government, anti-conservative approach, trying to pressure all private companies with the power of the federal government to follow his government hiring practices rather than respecting the free market. He's also threatening different organizations and companies with reviews, with legal reviews of various types. Highly unlikely legal experts think that there would be a valid case to go after a company for how it hires people, but that's also in the push. So the political crusade is a long ways from the recent history and the facts. And look, none of this means that all DEI programs work perfectly, or that this should even be the focus. I mentioned the military has used affirmative action for years. I showed you colleges. We saw diversity in our actual representative democracy, which makes sense, trying to have our representatives generally reflect the whole population, which is a struggle for a country like ours. Doesn't mean the corporations are the natural home for this. We could also try listening to the leaders across the spectrum who have actually spent years working on these challenges, leading on these challenges, dealing with these in a serious way. If you go to a policy and you take a policy to a large organization and you actually care, you seriously look at the data over years. There has been several Supreme Court cases about these diversity programs. Affirmative action, for example, was limited over time to make sure that it functioned in a more fair way, that it was merit-based, that it also dealt with class to some degree. But all of that work was dealing with trade-offs that aren't exactly new, and a heck of a lot of people took it seriously. Because underneath this is not just claims of merit, which we showed some folks don't care about, not just questions of who gets the good job or how we deal with diversity in some broad sense. It actually doubles back to something we felt in the last several elections and in a lot of the strife we're dealing with, and a lot of the ways that people want you to give up or think we are in our worst times, which of course depends on what we all do. America is actually different from many other countries and societies and the way they were founded. Remember, something very simple, we learn about it in school. Unlike so many other places, the United States was actually founded as a pluralistic society, not bound by one religion or one race living together, or even by birthplace. And so all of this comes back, I argue to you tonight, based on the evidence, to something much deeper. Can we still forge ways for all of us to coexist and meaningfully share power as we listen to those other leaders and the lessons of the past, or will we allow ourselves to crumble in division?
Equality and diversity can go hand in hand, and they must.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion are the core values of this country.
We believe our diversity, our differences, when joined together by a common set of ideals, makes us stronger, makes us more creative.
I think it's a very important principle. I hope it isn't in danger. It shouldn't be. We are a nation comprised of people from many different countries, backgrounds, religions.
Most economists who studied it agree that affirmative action has also been an important part of closing gaps in economic opportunity in our society, thereby strengthening the entire economy.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion is proof that the American dream works